They called it the soldier's last chance. A weapon so small and so crude that it seemed absurd to imagine it could bring down the armored giants of the battlefield. And yet, by 1944 and 1945, tens of thousands of German infantrymen, many of them no older than schoolboys or already fathers of families, carried one thing in common: a Panzerfaust. On paper, it promised them a chance to stop a tank. In reality, for 3 out of every 4 men who used it, the moment they pulled the trigger was the beginning of their own obituary. The Panzerfaust was born out of desperation. At the start of the war, the German army had moved with speed and steel, its panzer divisions tearing through Poland, France, and deep into the Soviet Union. But by 1943, the tide had turned. Stalingrad had been lost, the Allies had landed in Italy, and the Luftwaffe no longer owned the skies. German armor was dwindling, its vaunted Tigers and Panthers too few to stem the tide of Allied tanks that poured onto the battlefields. Something had to fill the gap. The solution was brutally simple: put anti-tank firepower directly into the hands of the common soldier. The weapon itself looked almost laughable. A thin launch tube, just over a meter long, with a wooden grip and a massive hollow charge warhead at the front that resembled the head of a hammerhead shark. It was single-use, disposable. Fire once, throw it away. For the factories of a collapsing Reich, this was its greatest strength. Each Panzerfaust cost a fraction of a tank shell, could be churned out by the hundreds of thousands, and placed directly into the hands of Volkssturm recruits, Hitler Youth, or exhausted frontline infantry. Propaganda posters sold it as a miracle weapon. 1 shot, 1 tank. Any man, no matter how old or young, could now claim to be a tank killer. But what those posters never said was that using it was as much suicide as strategy. The Panzerfaust was only effective at close range, 30 to 60 meters in theory, often less in practice. Imagine it: a Soviet T-34 or an American Sherman grinding forward, its engine howling, its treads shaking the ground beneath your boots. You wait behind rubble, behind a half-collapsed wall, or in a ditch, knowing that firing too early means the rocket will bounce harmlessly off the sloped armor, and firing too late means being crushed under 30 tons of steel. At the right moment, you rise, shoulder the tube, and fire. If you're lucky, the shaped charge jet burns through armor and turns the crew compartment into an inferno. If you're not, if the shot glances off, if the warhead fails, if you miss, then the tank is still coming. And even if you hit, survival was far from guaranteed. The flash of the backblast instantly revealed your position. Tanks rarely moved alone. They came with infantry walking beside them, with machine gunners scanning the ruins, with artillery ready to hammer any nest of resistance. The moment a Panzerfaust fired, it was like lighting a flare in the dark. Everyone knew exactly where you were. Many gunners had only seconds of triumph before being cut down by automatic fire, grenades, or a second tank rolling forward. German officers were not blind to these realities. They read the after-action reports. They knew the losses. They knew that in city fighting, in Warsaw, in Budapest, in the final inferno of Berlin, Panzerfaust ambushes often destroyed tanks at shocking rates, but at equally shocking human cost. A single Sherman knocked out might mean 3, 4, or 5 teenagers dead in the rubble, their bodies never even collected before the next Soviet assault wave pushed through. And still, command kept distributing the tubes. To them, each destroyed tank justified the lives spent. To the boys in the ruins, it felt like drawing tickets in a lottery where death held almost all of the numbers. By late 1944, the weapon was everywhere. Over 6 million Panzerfausts were produced. Entire battalions no longer had tanks at all, just infantry armed with these tubes, ordered to hold crossroads, to wait in cellars, to fire at tanks at ranges so close that the gunner could see the terrified face of a Soviet conscript clinging to the turret. These were not battles of maneuver or glory. They were ambushes, last stands, desperate measures in a war already lost. The irony was cruel. The Panzerfaust really could kill tanks. It was effective, devastating even, when fired correctly. Allied crews feared it deeply, to the point that whole tactical manuals were rewritten to warn against advancing without infantry cover. But the price for every successful shot was staggering. 75% of the men who fired never lived to fire a second time. They were crushed under tracks, torn apart by shrapnel, or riddled with bullets before they could even throw away the spent tube. For the men who carried it, there was no illusion. They knew the odds. They whispered it in foxholes, in basements, in ruined factories. 3 die for 1 tank. Still, they shouldered the tubes. Some out of duty, some out of fear, some because they had no choice. Their names are mostly forgotten, buried in rubble or lost to time. What remains is the statistic, a weapon that made every soldier into a potential tank killer, and every tank killer into a likely corpse. Subscribe for more forgotten war stories. Drop a like if you want the second part, and tell me in the comments what you think about these suicide odds. When the Panzerfaust first appeared on the Eastern Front, Soviet tank crews laughed at it. They called it a pipe with fireworks, a toy compared to their 30-ton T-34s. But they stopped laughing fast. By late 1943, as the Germans retreated through Ukraine and Belarus, entire Soviet columns began losing tanks to ambushes in shattered villages. One soldier with a Panzerfaust could make a whole company hesitate. And in war, hesitation kills. Yet what history remembers less clearly is what happened to those men after they fired. Reports from the front described streets littered with both burning tanks and the bodies of the gunners who killed them. The reason was simple: range. To use a Panzerfaust, a man had to be dangerously close. In snowy forests near Vitebsk, Volksgrenadiers dug foxholes just 50 meters from expected tank routes. They waited, silent in the cold, until the steel beasts thundered past. When they fired, the explosion lit up the snow. The tank erupted in fire, and Soviet infantry immediately swarmed the tree line. Whole platoons vanished within minutes. Command noted excellent tank destruction rates, but unsustainable losses in personnel. That phrase appeared again and again. In the West, it was no different. When the Allies landed in Normandy in 1944, Panzerfaust teams were scattered through hedgerows and villages. They scored kills against Shermans and Cromwells, sometimes halting entire advances for hours. But those same hedgerows became traps. Allied commanders quickly adapted. Tanks no longer advanced alone. Infantry fanned out in front, machine guns raked every bush, and artillery pounded suspected ambush points. A German soldier might fire once, even knock out a tank. But within seconds, the combined fury of the Allied response would erase him. This reality shaped how Panzerfaust units were deployed. They weren't permanent squads with long survival chances. They were fire brigades made of flesh, rushed to plug gaps in collapsing lines, given little rest, little training, and less hope. In Hungary, during the defense of Budapest, teenage conscripts were ordered to hold crossroads with nothing but Panzerfausts. Soviet tanks rolled down avenues in endless waves. The first shot might succeed, the second never came. Survivors recalled stepping over the bodies of their friends to grab still-loaded tubes, firing again and waiting for the inevitable counterfire. Even the weapon itself betrayed its users. The backblast from firing was enormous, creating a flash and a cloud that pointed directly to the gunner's hideout. In tight city ruins, that meant instant death. The tube was clumsy to reload, and in many cases, it wasn't even possible. Soldiers carried one shot, sometimes two, knowing they would probably never live to use more. And unlike tanks with turrets where crews had compartments, the Panzerfaust fighter was alone, fully exposed. When the counterattack came, there was no steel armor to hide behind, no engine to drive away. The German command understood these risks, but had little choice. Production was collapsing, tanks were irreplaceable, and the front demanded miracles. So the Panzerfaust became the miracle. In propaganda, posters showed heroic men kneeling with the weapon, tanks bursting into flames around them. In reality, those heroes lasted minutes. Each tank destroyed was purchased with lives that could never be replaced. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany in early 1945, the pattern only grew more tragic. In Cologne, in Königsberg, in the final ruins of Berlin, Panzerfaust teams haunted the rubble like ghosts. They stalked tanks at close range, sometimes from upper floors, sometimes from sewers. A successful shot might turn a street into a temporary graveyard of Allied armor. But the cost never changed. 3 dead for everyone who fired. By then, even commanders began to call it what it truly was. Not a weapon of victory, but a weapon of sacrifice. The Panzerfaust gave ordinary soldiers the power to kill machines worth hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks. But it also turned those same soldiers into expendable parts of a strategy built on human lives. The battlefield statistics were clear. The weapon worked, but the survival rate, barely 25%, was a death sentence written into the trigger pull itself. By 1945, the Panzerfaust was everywhere. 6 million had rolled off German assembly lines, more than any tank or armored vehicle the Reich could produce. They were stacked in wooden crates inside ruined churches, handed out by nervous sergeants on city street corners, and pushed into the arms of boys in Hitler Youth uniforms whose hands still shook when they pulled the pins. Germany's armies were broken, its divisions hollowed out. But what it still had was rubble, desperation, and Panzerfausts. In the last months of the war, the weapon turned the ruins of Europe into killing grounds. Allied tankers hated the cities most. In open country, they could maneuver, fire from range, and call in airstrikes. But inside Berlin, inside Vienna, inside the shattered blocks of Königsberg, every shadow could hide a man with a Panzerfaust. The streets became a nightmare of ambushes. Tanks burned at intersections, their crews screaming inside sealed hatches as the shaped charge tore through armor like paper. Allied reports described entire platoons of Shermans lost to single alleys, advancing cautiously one by one, spraying machine gun fire into windows, knowing that at any moment, a lone German could fire from 10 meters away and end them. But that same nightmare extended to the gunners themselves. For every successful ambush, there was retaliation measured not in single bullets, but in barrages. Soviet doctrine was merciless. When a tank went down, infantry poured fire into every building around it. Grenades and flamethrowers scouring stairwells, artillery shells pounding whole blocks to dust. American units did the same. They learned to blast buildings apart before tanks even entered a street, to drown ruins in fire before a Panzerfaust could be lifted. For the men waiting with the weapon, there was no escape. You fired, and within moments you became the center of an explosion of fury designed to erase you. Worse still, most who carried the weapon by 1945 were not seasoned veterans, but replacements. Volkssturm conscripts dragged from factories, gray-haired men barely able to march, and boys barely tall enough to hold the launch tube steady. Training often lasted less than a day. Some learned only by watching older comrades die. There are stories of 15-year-olds hiding in basements, clutching a Panzerfaust, shaking so violently that the first shot went into a wall instead of a tank. They rarely had a second chance. In Berlin, Panzerfausts were so common that Soviet tank crews joked bitterly about driving through a forest of fire. But for every T-34 that went up in flames, dozens of German teenagers fell. In one documented street battle near Alexanderplatz, a Soviet tank company lost 5 vehicles in under 30 minutes. Yet almost every single ambusher was killed in the firefight that followed. Out of more than 40 men who began the ambush, barely 9 survived to see the next dawn. That was the arithmetic of the Panzerfaust. Victory written in blood ratios no army could sustain. And yet, for all its horror, the weapon did shape the battlefield. It slowed the Allied advance. It forced commanders to crawl where they once charged. It turned ruined blocks into fortresses where armor hesitated and infantry suffered. The Panzerfaust couldn't save Germany, but it could make every block, every street, every bridge a graveyard for both sides. To the generals, that was enough. To the men in the rubble, it was hell on earth. A weapon cheap enough to give anyone the power to kill a tank, but costly enough to guarantee most of them would never live to fire again. It was a weapon of sacrifice, disguised as salvation, and it devoured its users as quickly as it destroyed the machines they faced. The Panzerfaust was never meant to be noble. It was crude, brutal, and designed for one thing only: to let flesh destroy steel. But as the Reich collapsed, the weapon took on a darker symbolism. It was handed out not only to soldiers, but to civilians, to shopkeepers, to schoolboys, to old men who could barely lift it. It turned an entire collapsing nation into a desperate army of human tripwires. On the Eastern Front, Soviet veterans still remembered the first time they saw entire families pressed into service. In East Prussia, women carried Panzerfausts down into cellars, waiting with their sons for tanks to roll by. Few survived. Those who fired were obliterated by return fire, and those who didn't were buried alive under the rubble when artillery pounded the city flat. In diaries recovered after the war, Soviet soldiers wrote of the horror of killing enemies who looked like children. One tank commander admitted he refused to report how many Hitler Youth with Panzerfausts his unit had shot, writing simply, "Too many. They came at us like shadows, and we had to kill them or die." In the West, Allied troops faced the same nightmare in the forests and villages of Germany. Reports from the Battle of the Bulge describe American units losing columns of Shermans to sudden strikes from boys in snow-covered foxholes. In one case, a single youth with a Panzerfaust destroyed 3 tanks before being torn apart by machine gun fire. His commander later admitted, he wasn't a soldier. He was just a kid with a death wish. But for 5 minutes, he changed the battle. What made the Panzerfaust uniquely lethal was its simplicity. It required almost no training. A few instructions shouted in a barn, a demonstration on how to aim, and anyone could use it. That was both its strength and its curse. Because the same simplicity meant that inexperienced fighters exposed themselves in the worst possible way. They fired too close and were killed in the blast. They aimed too early and gave themselves away. They missed and had no chance to reload. For every spectacular success, there were countless failures that ended in sudden, anonymous death. German high command knew all of this. They read the casualty numbers. They received the reports of platoons erased within hours. But they also saw the other number: destroyed tanks. In Berlin alone, Panzerfausts accounted for hundreds of Soviet vehicles knocked out in just days. To the desperate leadership, that was all that mattered. They traded children for tanks, fathers for Shermans, entire Volkssturm units for a single crossroads, held for one more hour. The irony was that the weapon worked so well, it terrified the Allies, even as it consumed its users. Tank crews advanced in constant fear, infantry fired into shadows, and artillery leveled whole districts just to eliminate a handful of possible ambushers. In doing so, the Panzerfaust didn't just kill tanks. It multiplied destruction. Entire neighborhoods became smoldering ruins because one boy fired from a window. For the men and boys who carried it, there was no glory. No medals, no recognition, no survival. Only the knowledge that when the moment came, they would probably not live another 5 minutes. The Panzerfaust turned them into human sacrifices, each one a disposable spark in a war already lost. And still, they fired. Out of duty, out of fear, out of orders shouted by officers who knew the odds. Some believed they were defending their homes. Some simply wanted revenge. Most had no choice at all. Their lives were traded like ammunition, and the ledger of the Reich marked them down as expendable. The Panzerfaust gave Germany one last weapon that mattered. But it also gave history one of the most tragic equations of the war. 3 lives for 1 tank. By the final weeks of the war, the Panzerfaust was no longer just a weapon. It had become the last symbol of a dying regime, a tool pressed into the hands of anyone who could stand upright. In Berlin, crates of them were stacked in subway stations, in schools, even in hospitals. Commanders handed them out like bread rations. Boys barely 14 walked the streets with launch tubes slung across their backs, while men in their 60s were told they could still defend the fatherland if they aimed true. It was madness disguised as resistance. The Soviet assault on the city revealed the weapon's terrible dual nature. In ambush after ambush, T-34s burst into flames, their crews scrambling out only to be cut down by snipers or trapped inside by fire. Soviet tankers spoke of Berlin as the most dangerous city they had ever entered. Not because of artillery, not because of heavy tanks, but because every ruined doorway might hide a boy with a Panzerfaust. The fear was real, and it slowed their advance. But for every tank destroyed, whole squads of Germans disappeared in counterfire. The Soviets adapted, responding with overwhelming force. Flamethrowers in basements, artillery at point-blank range, entire buildings collapsed just to eliminate a single gunner. The city became a graveyard, where victory and death came hand in hand. American and British soldiers, advancing from the west, wrote of the same experience. In Cologne, in the Ruhr, in small towns turned fortresses, they lost Shermans and Churchills to ambushes from alleys and rooftops. The pattern was always the same. A tank knocked out, a moment of chaos, and then the inevitable counterstrike that left the ambushers dead. Survivors remembered comrades dragged from rubble, burned alive by their own weapon's backblast, or riddled with bullets before the smoke cleared. The statistics at war's end were brutal. Millions of Panzerfausts had been produced. Tens of thousands of tanks had been destroyed or crippled. And yet, 75% of the men who fired the weapon never lived to do it again. For Germany, it was a weapon of numbers. Sacrifice measured against steel. Young lives spent to slow an enemy that could not be stopped. For the men who carried it, it was simply a death sentence with a trigger. The irony is that the Panzerfaust was effective. So effective that after the war, its design influenced rocket weapons worldwide. Its shaped charge warhead became the model for countless future anti-tank weapons. In military textbooks, it was praised as revolutionary. But behind every technical diagram and statistic lies the truth. Its effectiveness was built on the graves of the men who used it. History remembers the Panzerfaust as a deadly innovation, a cheap miracle that let one man stop a tank. But it should also be remembered for what it demanded. It promised victory in a single shot, but at the price of the shooter's life. 3 dead for every 1 tank. Boys and old men buried under ruins, their stories lost in the smoke of a war already lost. That is why 75% of Panzerfaust teams died. Not because they lacked courage, not because the weapon failed, but because it was designed to trade lives for time. And time was the only thing Germany had left. If you want more hidden truths from World War II, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment with the battles or weapons you want me to uncover next.